The morning they meant to hang Luke Barnett, the sky over Caldwell, Kansas was the color of a bruised purple and yellow and ugly at its edges. And Francis Slater was the only soul in the entire county who thought that maybe, just maybe, they had the wrong man. It was the summer of 1879, and Caldwell sat fat and restless on the Kansas Indian Territory line, a cattle town where fortunes were made and lost between sundown and sunrise, where the dust never fully settled and the law wore its badge like a weapon rather than a promise. Frances had come to Caldwell 3 years prior with her husband, Gerald Slater, who had dreams of running a dry goods store along the main thoroughfare. Gerald was a decent man, soft-handed and earnest, the kind of man who remembered birthdays and couldn't quite look a horse in the eye without apologizing. He had died 14 months ago of a fever that swept through the boarding house district like fire through dry grass, and Frances had buried him in the rocky ground at the edge of town with a wooden cross that she repainted every spring. She was 28 years old and she owned the dry goods store outright now, and she managed it with the quiet ferocity of a woman who had decided that grief was not a luxury she could afford. She had not planned to go to the hanging. She had, in fact, planned to take inventory of her flour and sugar stock that morning, because Tuesday was always inventory day, and she was a woman who kept to her schedules the way a drowning person keeps to driftwood. But the night before the execution, she had been unable to sleep, and she had found herself sitting at the small desk in the back room of the store where she kept her ledgers, reading through a letter that had been slipped under her door sometime in the gray hours before dawn. The letter was unsigned. The handwriting was careful and slightly unsteady, the hand of someone writing in a hurry or writing in fear. It read, "The man they're hanging tomorrow did not shoot Hector Prout. Hector Prout was shot by Delman Cole's men because Hector was going to testify about the cattle rustling operation Cole runs out of the South pasture. Luke Barnett was a drover passing through. He was in the wrong place and they pinned it on him because Cole owns Judge Aldrich and nobody who matters is going to say a word. If you have any decency, go to that gallows and speak. Nobody else will." Frances had read the letter 4 times. Then she had set it down on the desk and stared at the far wall for a long while. She was not a woman who involved herself in the politics of Caldwell, not because she didn't care, but because she had learned early that a widow woman running a store alone could not afford enemies the way a man with a ranch and a rifle could. She had kept her head down for 14 months, and it had served her well enough. She picked the letter up and read it a 5th time. She thought about Hector Prout, who had bought cornmeal and dried beans from her every Thursday, and who had always taken his hat off when he came through her door. She had heard he was dead, shot in the back, they said, which was not the kind of shooting a man like Luke Barnett, a stranger with no grudge and no history, would do. Shooting a man in the back was the kind of killing that came from cold business, not hot blood. She thought about Judge Aldrich, who had presided over the trial that lasted 2 days and produced a verdict in under an hour. She thought about Delman Cole, who owned the largest cattle operation in Sumner County and who ate dinner at the hotel every evening and looked at everyone else in the room like they were furniture he hadn't decided whether to keep. When the sky outside her window began to lighten toward that bruised purple, Frances Slater folded the letter and put it in the pocket of her dress and went to wash her face. She arrived at the gallows at 8:30 in the morning, when the crowd had already gathered in the wide square beside the jailhouse. There were maybe 60 people there, which was more than she expected and fewer than she feared. Some of them were there the way people always are at such things, drawn by the morbid gravity of it, their faces arranged in expressions of solemn propriety that barely concealed something older and uglier. Some of them looked genuinely uncomfortable, shifting their weight from boot to boot, not quite meeting each other's eyes. The gallows itself was a plain wooden structure, practical and terrible, with a trapdoor and a rope that swayed slightly in the morning wind off the plains. Sheriff Moss Denton stood at the base of the steps with his thumbs in his gun belt, a broad man with a gray mustache, and the look of someone who had made peace with distasteful things a long time ago. Deputy Crane stood to his left, younger, sharper-eyed, and not nearly as comfortable. Frances pressed through the edge of the crowd. People looked at her with mild surprise. She was known in town, the widow woman who ran the store on Commerce Street, and her presence here was not expected. She paid their looks no mind and moved toward the front, because if she was going to do this at all, she was going to do it properly. They brought Luke Barnett out of the jailhouse at 20 minutes before 9. She had not known what to expect of him. The letter had called him a drover passing through, and she had formed some vague image of a weathered, anonymous figure. What she saw instead was a man of perhaps 30 years, lean and dark-haired, with his hands bound in front of him and a bruise along his jaw that suggested the last 2 weeks in custody had not been gentle. He walked with his head up. That was the first thing she noticed, that despite everything, despite the rope and the crowd and the morning light that had nothing kind about it, he walked with his head up and his eyes open, and he looked at everything around him with a directness that seemed almost defiant. He was not afraid in the way she had expected. He was something quieter than afraid, something more resigned but not broken, like a man who had run out of options and had made some private accounting of himself in the night. Sheriff Denton read the charges aloud from a sheet of paper. The murder of Hector Prout by means of a firearm on the night of June the 3rd, 1879, within the county of Sumner in the state of Kansas. The voice was flat and official, and it fell on the square like stones dropped in water. Frances's heart was hammering so loudly she was surprised no one around her could hear it. She pressed her hands against the front of her skirt to keep them from shaking. When Denton finished reading, there was a brief procedural pause, the kind that existed to allow any last words or final business. It was in that pause, that specific held-breath moment before the condemned man was led up the steps, that Frances Slater opened her mouth and spoke in a voice that was steadier than she had any right to expect from herself. "I have something to say." The crowd turned. Every head swung toward her with the uniformity of a wheat field bending in wind. Sheriff Denton looked at her with an expression that moved through surprise and irritation before settling somewhere in the vicinity of wary calculation. "Mrs. Slater," he said, "this is not the time or place for—" "It is exactly the time and place," she said, and her voice did not waver. "You are about to hang a man, and I have information pertinent to whether that man is guilty of the crime you've charged him with." The murmur that ran through the crowd was low and complicated. She didn't look at anyone but the sheriff. Denton took 2 steps toward her. "This trial has been conducted and the verdict has been rendered by Judge Aldrich," she said, "who has supped at Delman Cole's table every Sunday for the last 1.5 years. I know because I have eyes, Sheriff, and I keep them open." That landed harder than she expected. The murmur in the crowd changed pitch. She heard someone near the back say Cole's name in a tone that was not deferential. She reached into her pocket and took out the letter. Her fingers were trembling now, just slightly, but she held it up so Denton could see it. "I received this letter last night. It names witnesses to the actual circumstances of Hector Prout's death. It names the men who committed it and the reason it was done. This man," she turned and looked directly at Luke Barnett for the first time, and something happened in that moment that she could not have predicted or explained. Some current passed between them that she felt in her sternum. This man was not in Sumner County the night Hector Prout was shot. He arrived in Caldwell on the 4th of June. Anyone who deals in livestock or keeps records at the livery can confirm that. The silence that followed was not the silence of a crowd that did not care. It was the silence of a crowd that was listening very carefully, which was a different and far more powerful thing. Luke Barnett stood at the foot of the gallows steps and he was looking at her. He was looking at her the way a man looks at something he cannot quite reconcile with everything else he knows about the world, with a kind of stunned, searching attention that she felt down to her boots. Denton reached her and held out his hand for the letter. She gave it to him because there was no reason not to. He read it with his expression carefully flat. Then he looked up at her and then at the crowd, and she could see him doing the arithmetic of it. The arithmetic of Cole's power against the arithmetic of 60 witnesses and a widow woman with a steady voice and a letter that named names. "The execution is postponed," Denton said finally, and his voice was like a door being dragged across gravel. "Pending investigation." What happened next was not clean or immediate or anything like the satisfying conclusions of dime novels. Luke Barnett was not freed that morning. He was taken back inside the jailhouse, and the crowd dispersed in the buzzing, fractured way of people who have witnessed something unexpected and don't yet know what to make of it. Two men in the crowd, Francis noticed them specifically. Hard-faced men with Cole's brand on their jacket buttons watched her walk away with expressions she did not allow herself to look at for too long. She went back to her store. She counted flour. She kept her hands busy because her mind was doing something she couldn't afford to let it do, which was circle back repeatedly to the image of Luke Barnett at the foot of those steps with his head up and his eyes finding hers. Over the next 4 days, Caldwell was a town holding its breath. Francis was not idle during those days. She spoke with Walter Briggs at the livery, who confirmed that a man matching Luke Barnett's description had brought his horse in on the morning of June 4th, not the evening of June 3rd. She spoke with Mabel Ashworth, who ran the boarding house on the north end of town, and who confirmed the same man had taken a room that morning and slept most of the day. She wrote everything down in the clear, meticulous hand she used for her ledgers. She gave the document to Deputy Crane, who was young enough to still have something like conscience working in him, and who took it with a look on his face that suggested he had been waiting for someone to hand him exactly that. On the second day after the postponed execution, Delman Cole came into her store. He was a tall man, broad in the chest, with silver hair and a way of occupying space that seemed to leave less of it for everyone else. He came alone, which she thought might have been a deliberate choice to make the visit seem casual, social, unthreatening. He picked up a tin of coffee from the shelf and turned it in his hands. "Francis," he said, like they were old friends. "Mr. Cole," she said from behind her counter. She did not come around from behind it. "I hear you've been asking questions around town." He set the coffee tin down and picked up another one. "About a drifter." "I've been asking questions about the timeline of events surrounding Hector Pruitt's death," she said, "which seems like a reasonable thing to ask about, given that a man's life depends on it being accurate." Cole looked at her with the kind of mild expression that is a threat wearing a costume. "You're a smart woman," he said. "Smart women know when they're stepping into business that isn't theirs." "Hector Pruitt bought cornmeal from me every Thursday," she said. "I would say that makes his death somewhat my business." Cole put the second coffee tin down. He looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he picked up his hat from the counter, where he had set it when he came in a habitual gesture that was also, she realized, a small display of ownership, putting his hat on her counter like he owned everything in his field of vision. "My condolences for the interruption to your morning," he said. "I hope you'll be more careful about the kind of correspondence you act on in the future." He left. Francis stood perfectly still for 30 seconds after the door closed behind him. Then she sat down on the stool behind the counter and let her hands shake as much as they wanted to. She was not sorry she had spoken, but she was frightened now in a way she hadn't been before, with the specific, clarifying fear of a person who has made an enemy they can see. Deputy Crane came to her store on the evening of the third day. He looked like a man who hadn't slept much. He told her that 2 ranch hands who had worked for Cole had come forward anonymously, unwilling to give their names officially, but privately confirming to him the details of the unsigned letter. He told her that the man who had actually shot Hector Pruitt was a hired gun named Rigby, who worked exclusively for Cole's operation and who had been seen leaving the area the following morning. He told her he had taken all of this to a circuit judge from Wichita who was passing through, a man named Elihu Graves who had no ties to Sumner County and owed Cole nothing. "Is it enough?" Francis asked him. Crane ran a hand through his hair. "It's enough for Graves. I don't know what it is for Denton." "Sheriff Denton has to answer to the county," Francis said. "And now the county knows there's a question." Crane nodded slowly. "Mrs. Slater," he said, "I want you to know that what you did at that gallows, that took a particular kind of courage." "It took a sleepless night and an unsigned letter," she said. "Those are the things courage is usually made of," Crane said. On the morning of the fourth day, Luke Barnett was released from the Caldwell jailhouse on the authority of Circuit Judge Elihu Graves, pending a formal inquiry into the Pruitt murder that would convene in Wichita. The charges against him were formally suspended. Delman Cole was not arrested, not then, but his name was attached to an official inquiry, which was its own particular kind of blow to a man who had spent years building the kind of untouchability that money and influence construct. Frances heard about the release from a boy who came running past her store window. She heard it and she kept counting flour. She was not sure what she expected. She had not done what she did with any expectation of anything in return. She had done it because the letter said a man was going to die for something he didn't do, and she had not been able to live with her eyes open and her mouth shut. She was still behind her counter at midday when the door to her store opened and Luke Barnett walked in. He was cleaned up now. The bruise on his jaw was yellowing at the edges, and his dark hair was damp from washing, and he had on a clean shirt that looked like it might be new, probably purchased from one of the other stores on Commerce Street. He held his hat in both hands, and he stood just inside the doorway for a moment, as if waiting to see whether he was welcome. He looked younger up close than he had at the gallows, or maybe it was just the difference between a man with a rope above his head and a man with his feet firmly on the ground. He had dark brown eyes with a quality she couldn't immediately name, not hardness exactly, more like depth, like a well that goes down farther than you expect. "You're Francis Slater," he said. It was not a question, it was a statement, but it had the quality of something he had been carrying around and waiting to say. She paused her pencil on the ledger. "I am." He took 2 steps into the store, still holding his hat. "My name is Luke Barnett." "I know," she said. Something passed over his face that might have been a small, complicated smile. "I know you know," he said. "I needed to say it anyway, so you'd have it from me." He paused. "I wanted to come and thank you. What you did, I was standing at those steps and I had made up my mind that it was going to happen and there was nothing left to do and then you spoke up." He stopped. He seemed to run out of the specific words he'd been building toward. "I don't know a single reason you should have done that for a man you'd never met." "Someone needed to," she said. "Most people in that crowd had 2 good reasons and no inclination," he said. "You had no reason and you did it anyway." "That is not a small thing, Mrs. Slater." She set her pencil down. She was not sure why, but having him use her formal name felt strange in a way that had nothing to do with manners. "Are you all right?" she asked. "They had you in there for 2 weeks. He looked at her steadily. "I'm all right," he said. "Better than I was 4 days ago, which I realize sets a low standard." He glanced around the store, taking it in with the quick, practical eye of someone who has spent a lot of time on the move and notices things without meaning to. "This is your store." "Mine," she said. "My husband left it to me when he died." There was a brief pause, not uncomfortable. "I'm sorry," he said. "About your husband." "Thank you," she said. It was the answer she always gave because it was the right one, but this time she noticed that she meant it more specifically than usual. He stood there for another moment, turning his hat slowly in his hands. She thought he might be about to leave, and she found that the thought produced in her a mild, irrational disagreement that she had no ready justification for. "Were you heading somewhere?" she asked. "Before Caldwell." He looked at her like the question surprised him. "I was making my way up from Texas," he said. "I'd been working a cattle drive. I was thinking about heading north, maybe finding work in Colorado or Wyoming territory. I hadn't made up my mind." He paused. "I don't suppose I've made it up yet, given the circumstances." "The inquiry will require you in Wichita," she said. "I know." He finally moved the hat to one hand and let it hang at his side. "I'm not sorry about that. Hector Pruitt deserved better than what happened to him. If what I know about the timeline helps settle that, I'll go to Wichita as many times as they need me." She looked at him carefully. There was something direct and uncomplicated about the way he said that, without performance or calculation, and she had spent 14 months in a cattle town becoming very good at reading the difference. "Do you have somewhere to stay?" she asked, "while you wait for the inquiry?" He shook his head, not helplessly but practically. "I'll find something. Mabel Ashworth on the North End takes boarders," she said. "She's honest with her rates and she doesn't ask too many questions, which I expect might be relevant at the moment." He looked at her with those dark, careful eyes. "Thank you," he said, and the way he said it was different from the general thanks he had come here to offer, more specific, more direct, like a hand extended rather than a wave made from a distance. "Don't thank me," she said. "Just go find a room and something to eat. You look like you haven't had a proper meal in 2 weeks." That produced the small, complicated expression again, and this time she could identify it as a smile that was trying very hard to be modest about the fact that it was glad to be alive. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He put his hat on and went to the door. He paused there with his hand on the frame. "Mrs. Slater," he said, "I'd like to come back tomorrow if that's all right with you. Not for anything particular, just I'd like to." She picked her pencil back up. "The store is open every day except Sunday," she said. "You're welcome to it." He nodded once and left. She heard his boots on the boards outside, and then the sound faded into the general noise of Commerce Street, and she was alone with her ledger and the midday light coming through the window in long gold stripes. She pressed the pencil very hard against the page and made a mark that had nothing to do with inventory. He came back the next day, and the day after that. He did not come empty-handed. The second morning he brought a small crate of goods he had found at the feed store that the feed store owner had mentioned was going to the wrong location, a box of misdelivered tin goods that properly belonged on Frances's shelves. He had taken the initiative to bring them directly to her, which was both practically helpful and entirely unnecessary, and she found both of those qualities annoying in the best possible way. The third morning he came in and helped her move a heavy shelf unit that she had been intending to reposition for the better part of 3 months. She had not asked him to do this. He had simply come in, noticed she was attempting to drag it by herself, and put his hands on the other end without comment. "You have good instincts," she told him, once the shelf was where she wanted it. "My mother always said I was better at doing than asking," he said. "Where is your mother?" she asked, and the question came out more personally than she had intended. "Amarillo," he said. "She's got a house there with my younger sister. They do all right." He dusted his hands off on the knees of his trousers. "I send money when I can, which with driving cattle is not always as regular as I'd like." She handed him a glass of water from the pitcher she kept on the back shelf. "You don't have land of your own?" He took the water and drank most of it before he answered. "I had some savings put by," he said. "I was thinking about buying a small parcel somewhere. That's partly why I was heading north. Land is cheaper in the Wyoming territory and there's grass enough for a modest operation." He paused, looking at the glass in his hand. 2 weeks in a Caldwell jail cell has put a dent in the timeline, but it hasn't changed the plan." She thought about that. She thought about a man who had a plan that extended past the next cattle drive, who was carrying a destination in his chest, even when he was standing in a jailhouse without knowing whether he would walk out. "That's a good plan," she said. He looked at her. "Is it?" "Land of your own is always a good plan," she said. "My husband built this store from nothing, and when he was gone it was mine, free and clear. There is no substitute for something that's yours." He was quiet for a moment. "You've built something good here," he said, looking at the store around him with the same attentive assessment she had noticed before. "You can feel that it's being taken care of. Some stores like this, you can tell they're just a means to money. This one feels like it means something to the person who runs it." She was surprised enough by that to have no immediate answer. She had not thought that the care she put into the store was visible to anyone else. It was a private thing. Her relationship with the shelves and the stock and the morning light and the smell of dry goods and cedar, the way it had become the container for everything she had salvaged from grief. "It does mean something," she said. He handed her back the glass, and their fingers were close enough on the rim that she was specifically aware of the proximity. He seemed aware of it too, in the small, careful way of a person who notices things without making spectacle of them. "I'd better let you get back to work," he said. She watched him leave for the third time and stood in the same spot for a moment longer than made sense, just breathing. The weeks that followed were a slow, specific kind of unfolding, like the way spring comes to the Kansas plain, not all at once, not in a rush, but in small increments of warmth that accumulate until one morning you step outside and the world has changed, and you almost can't account for when it happened. Luke found work at the livery, tending horses in the mornings and doing odd jobs around town in the afternoons, while he waited for the Wichita inquiry to convene. He was, Frances observed over time, exactly what he presented himself to be, which she had learned from 14 months in Caldwell was much rarer than it should have been. He was straightforward without being blunt, quiet without being cold, and he had a quality of attention when he listened to someone speak that made you feel like what you were saying was worth hearing. He began eating his midday meal at the small table in the back room of her store. This had started practically, when she had mentioned almost offhandedly that she usually heated soup over the small iron stove back there, and he had arrived the next day at exactly the right time, which was a kind of answer that did not require words. Within 2 weeks, it had become a thing they both relied on without saying so. They talked during those midday hours with the ease of two people who have established, without negotiating it, a particular comfort with each other. He told her about driving cattle up from Texas, the dust and the distances, and the peculiar, self-contained society of a cattle drive, the way a group of men and animals could form a working world of its own, and then disperse at the end of a drive like it had never existed. He told her about a trail boss named Garrity who had taken him on at 17 and taught him more about reading weather and reading men than any school had ever offered. He told her about a summer when the Kishom Trail had flooded so badly they had to hold the herd for 3 weeks at a river crossing, and the men had passed the time playing cards and telling stories until the stories got strange from repetition. She told him about Gerald more than she had told anyone in 14 months, more than she had intended to. She told him about the store, how they had built it together, how Gerald had been better with people and she had been better with numbers, how they had argued about whether to stock dry beans or chickpeas. She had one, which she had been right about, which she told Luke with a frankness that made him laugh. She told him about the fever, about the 3 days at Gerald's bedside when she had read to him from the only book she had in the store, which was a surveyor's almanac, because she couldn't bring herself to read anything that required more feeling than plain facts. He would have liked it, she said. Gerald always said useful books were the only honest ones. Luke was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup on the table. "He sounds like a man who was at peace with himself," he said. "He was," she said. "That was the thing about Gerald. He never spent much time wanting to be something he wasn't." She paused. "I think that made it easier for the people around him. You always knew where you stood." "That's a gift," Luke said. "Not everyone's given it." "Were you?" she asked. He thought about it seriously, which she appreciated. He didn't deflect or make it light the way some men would. "I think I know what I want," he said. "I'm not always sure how to say it plainly." He looked at her with those dark, steady eyes. "I'm working on that." She did not ask him what he wanted. Not then. But the words sat in the air between them like a seed dropped in good soil, which is to say it was there, and she knew it was there, and she let it be. The inquiry in Wichita was convened in the 3rd week of August 1879. Luke rode out on a Thursday morning, having told Frances the night before over supper at the hotel. The first time they had eaten supper together in public, which was its own kind of declaration for a town that noticed everything. He told her he expected to be in Wichita for 4 or 5 days, and she told him to be careful on the road, and he said he would, and there was a moment at the end of the evening when they stood outside the hotel in the warm August dark, and neither of them moved to leave immediately. "Francis," he said, and stopped. She waited. She had gotten good at waiting for what he was working toward. "When I come back," he said, "I'd like to take you for a ride, out on the plain, away from town. I want to show you something, if you'll let me." She looked at him in the lamplight coming through the hotel window. He was a man who had spent 3 weeks in her back room eating soup and talking, who had moved her shelves without being asked and carried misdelivered goods across Commerce Street and looked at her like she was the only thing worth looking at in a room full of distractions. "All right," she said. He went to Wichita. He was gone for 6 days, one more than planned, and Francis was aware of his absence in the way you are aware of a tooth that's been pulled. The absence itself becomes a presence, an outline of a shape you didn't know mattered until it wasn't there. He sent a letter from Wichita on the 4th day. It was brief and practical, telling her the inquiry was proceeding and that the anonymous ranch hands had agreed to give formal testimony and that Judge Graves was running a clean process. He added at the bottom, in handwriting that was slightly different from the rest of the letter, more deliberate, like he had paused before writing it, that he hoped the store was busy and that she was keeping the soup warm. She folded that letter and put it in the same pocket she had put the unsigned letter in, 6 weeks before. He came back on a Wednesday afternoon with dust on his coat and his hat brim, and the news that the Wichita inquiry had formally identified Rigby as the shooter in the Pruitt murder, and had referred the broader conspiracy charges against Delman Cole to a federal circuit court. Delman Cole was not yet arrested. These things moved at the speed of legal machinery, which was slow and grinding, but the ground under him had shifted considerably, and in a cattle town, reputation was its own particular kind of capital. Luke came directly to the store. He was trail dusty and travel tired, and he came through the door and looked at her with an expression that she recognized after a moment as simple, uncomplicated relief. The relief of a man who had been wondering, the whole ride back, whether the thing he had left was still going to be there. "Hello," she said. "Hello," he said. She put the kettle on. 2 days after he returned, they rode out onto the plain as he had promised. She had a good horse, a sorrel mare named Patience, which she had named with irony 3 years ago and had since grown to feel the name was honest. Luke rode a gray gelding he had bought with part of his first month's wages from the livery, which he had told her he planned to sell when he eventually left Caldwell, and she had not commented on the word eventually. He took her south and west of town, out where the buildings and the noise fell away, and the land spread out in every direction with the enormous, uncomplicated confidence that flat land has. It simply goes on, without apology, without drama, just the grass and the sky and the wind making the grass move in long, rolling waves like the memory of an ocean. He stopped his horse at a low rise, just enough elevation to extend the view, and she stopped beside him and they sat their horses in silence for a while. "When I was riding the trail," he said, "there were days when the country was so big and empty you felt like you might just dissolve into it if you weren't paying attention. Some of the men found that frightening." He looked at the horizon. "I never did. I always felt like the bigness was on your side if you understood it right. Like there was enough room out here for whatever you were trying to build." She looked at the grass moving in the wind. "What are you trying to build?" she asked. He turned to look at her. The afternoon light was full and warm, and it was on his face, and she met his eyes without looking away. "Something that lasts," he said. "Something that means something. The kind of thing where every year it exists it's a little more itself than it was the year before." He paused. "I know that's not a very precise description." "It's precise enough," she said. He reached across the distance between their horses and took her hand from where it rested on the saddle horn. His hand was rough from work and warm from the afternoon, and she felt the contact move through her like a note struck on a quiet piano, clear and resonant and lasting. "I am not a man who has a great deal to offer at present," he said. I have my wages from the livery and the savings I have left and the plan I told you about. I am 30 years old and I have been in more places than I have owned ground, and until 6 weeks ago, I had never met a woman who made me want to stop moving. He held her hand carefully, like it was something worth being careful with. I know this is not very long to have known someone. I know you have a life built here, a store that's yours, and I am not asking you to give anything up. I am asking whether you might be willing, not now, not necessarily soon, to let me keep coming back to that back room and see what kind of thing this becomes. Frances Slater had been practical her entire adult life. She had been practical about marrying Gerald, whom she had loved, but had also assessed with the sober honesty of a woman who knew that love and practicality needed to occupy the same house, or one of them would suffer. She had been practical about grief, and about the store, and about the letter she had received in the gray hours of a June morning. She had been practical about everything. She looked at Luke Barnett in the afternoon light on the Kansas plain, and felt the specific sensation of practicality, and something else arriving at the same destination from different directions and meeting there. You can keep coming back to that back room, she said, and we'll see. He looked at her with the expression she had been cataloging for 6 weeks, that quiet, deep, particular gladness that was always bigger than he made room for on his face. He squeezed her hand once, gently, and then released it, and they turned their horses back toward Caldwell with the wind at their backs. The late summer and the fall of 1879 passed with the fullness of two people who have decided, jointly and without excessive ceremony, to be in each other's lives. Luke remained at Mabel Ashworth's boarding house and worked at the livery, and spent his evenings at Frances's store, or walking with her along Commerce Street after it emptied out, when the town settled into a quieter version of itself, and the sky went from gold to rose to the deep, saturated blue of plains dusk. They had arguments, because they were both people with minds of their own and opinions about things. They argued about the right price for a barrel of flour, and about the best route north to Wyoming, and about whether Delman Cole's eventual reckoning would come through the courts or through the slower, less formal mechanisms of a community that now knew his name was connected to an honest man's murder. Luke thought the courts would handle it adequately. Frances was less confident. She was right, Cole would not face formal conviction for another 18 months, tangled as the case became in jurisdictional complications, but the social verdict came faster, and the hotel stopped setting his usual corner table, and the men who had tipped their hats to him in the street began to develop a habit of looking elsewhere. In a cattle town, that was a particular kind of sentence. She learned things about him that she filed away with the careful attention of a woman who does not stop observing, just because she has decided to feel something. She learned that he woke before dawn regardless of what time he had gone to sleep, because years on the cattle trail had calibrated him to early light. She learned that he was quietly and consistently kind to people that other people dismissed, to the Chinese laundress on Cedar Street who got too much trouble from too many directions, to the boys who hung around the livery and wanted to look at horses, to the old Osage man named Henry who sat on the bench outside the hardware store, and whose presence made some of the white townspeople visibly uncomfortable in ways they didn't examine. "You speak to Henry every time you pass," she said one evening. "He was here before the town was," Luke said. "Seems like the least a man can do is say good morning." She had looked at him for a long moment. "You are a better man than most," she said. He had looked startled and then quietly pleased in equal measure. "You're a kinder judge than most," he said. "I'm not kind," she said. "I'm accurate." In October, a letter arrived from the federal court in Wichita, confirming that the charges in the Prute matter were proceeding, and that Luke Barnett's presence would be required for formal testimony the following month. It also contained an apology, written in the stiff formal prose of legal documents, for the role of the county in wrongfully charging him, which was not precisely a reckoning but was something. He read the letter at the back room table and she watched him read it, and when he put it down he was quiet for a long time. "He was a good man," Luke said. "Prut. I only met him briefly, but you could tell." "He was," Francis said. "He deserves for it to mean something," Luke said. "That they know what actually happened, that the right people answer for it." "They will," she said. He looked up at her. "You always sound sure." "I'm not always sure," she said. "But I find it useful to sound that way until the feeling catches up." He laughed, and the sound of it in that small back room was warm and genuine, and she felt it in the same place she had felt the letter about Wyoming, in the part of her that was building something and didn't have a name for it yet but could feel the shape of it taking form. On the first Sunday in November, Luke came to the store, which was closed, because Sunday was the one day she kept, and knocked at the door. She was not expecting him. She came to the door in her plain day dress with her hair pinned simply, and she opened it, and he was standing there with his hat in his hands, which she had come to recognize as the posture that meant he was working up to something. She let him in. They sat at the front of the store with the morning light coming through the window, with the town quiet around them the way only a Sunday town can be quiet. He told her he had been writing letters. He had been corresponding with a land agent in Cheyenne, Wyoming territory, who had identified a parcel of land outside a small settlement called Laramie, 160 acres of good grass, reliable water from a creek that ran year-round, a modest existing structure that would need work but was fundamentally sound. The price was within what he had, if barely. "I have the money to buy it," he said. "I've been thinking about when to go." He turned his hat in his hands. "I want to go before winter makes the roads worse. But Francis, I don't want to leave here." He looked at her directly. "I don't want to leave you." She was very still. "I have been thinking," he said, "every day for the last 2 months about what to say to you. I have been thinking about whether it is too soon and whether I have a right to ask and whether you have any reason in the world to say yes." He paused. "I don't have very good answers to any of those questions. What I have is this. I have never been sure of a thing in my life the way I'm sure about you. I know what I want to build. I told you out there on the plain. I want to build something with you, Francis. I would like very much for you to come to Laramie with me, as my wife, if you'll have me. But if that's more than you want, if it's too fast or too much, then I will stay in Caldwell and keep coming to this store, and I will wait for however long it takes, because that is a fair trade for the possibility of you." Francis sat with that for a moment. She sat with the practicalities first, as was her nature, the store, her business, the life she had built. She sat with the strangeness of it, the speed of it, the particular wildness of a woman who had buried one husband and was being asked to build a second life. She sat with the fear, which was real and not nothing. And then she sat with what was also true, that she had been happy in a way she had not expected to be happy again. That the back room of her store had a different quality when he was in it. That she had started waking before dawn, not because she needed to, but because some part of her wanted to be up and moving when he was, as if the hours of the day had rearranged themselves around a gravitational center she hadn't consciously acknowledged. "The store," she said. "I know," he said. "I could sell it," she said. "It's a good business. It would sell fair." She paused. "Or I could ask Mabel Ashworth's nephew, the one who's been wanting to get into trade. He'd buy it for a fair price and he'd keep it good." Luke went very still in his chair. He was listening with his whole body. "Laramie," she said. "That's Wyoming territory." "It is," he said. "The land you described," she said. "The parcel, the creek." "It runs north-south," he said. "The agent says it's good for cattle and some crops. The grass is deep." She looked at him for a long, clear, deliberate moment. She looked at him the way she looked at ledgers when she was making a final accounting, with the full force of her attention and without the luxury of wishful thinking. "Yes," she said. The single syllable seemed to surprise him, even though he had asked for it, as if the reality of it arrived differently than the hope of it. He leaned forward and took both her hands from where they were folded in her lap and held them, and there was nothing elaborate or theatrical about it. It was simply the gesture of a man who needed the confirmation of touch, of being able to feel that the thing was real. "Francis," he said, just her name, held like something precious. "Yes," she said again, more simply, with a smile she couldn't have stopped if she'd tried. They were married in the Caldwell church in the second week of November 1879, on a Thursday, because Thursday was not inventory day, and she had decided to let that be its own small tribute to the life she was making room for. The ceremony was brief and plain and exactly right. Deputy Crane stood up as witness for Luke, and Mabel Ashworth stood up for Francis, and the reverend who performed it had known both of them long enough to speak with some genuine feeling and briefly enough to not overdo it. Francis wore a dress the color of winter wheat, which was the closest thing she had to a wedding dress, and she carried a small bunch of late autumn flowers that Luke had found somewhere. She never asked where, because the not asking felt like its own intimacy. He wore his good coat and his cleanest boots, and he looked at her when she came down the small aisle of the church with an expression that she felt she would be able to return to for the rest of her life and find it unchanged. When Reverend Morrison asked if Luke took Frances to be his wife, Luke said yes in a voice that was clear and steady and had no performance in it whatsoever, and Frances thought, in that exact moment, that it was the most honest-sounding yes she had ever heard. They sold the store to Mabel Ashworth's nephew James within a fortnight. He was 24 and eager and a little frightened of it, which Frances took as a good sign. She had learned that uncomplicated confidence in a new venture was usually the confidence of someone who didn't understand the venture. She spent 3 days walking him through the ledgers and the supplier relationships and the particular preferences of the regular customers, and when she left the store for the last time, she stood at the door for a moment and looked at it the way you look at a thing you built with your hands and your grief and your stubborn insistence on keeping going. She touched the door frame. "Thank you," she said, to the store, to Gerald, to the life she had carried here. And then she closed the door and walked to where Luke was waiting with the wagon. They left Caldwell on a Monday in late November with the wagon loaded and the sorrel mare tied behind and Luke's gray gelding under him. The sky was the pale clear blue of late autumn, enormous above the flat land, and the wind was cold but not yet brutal. Frances sat on the wagon bench with her hands wrapped in wool and watched Caldwell get smaller behind her until the buildings were just a darker line against the pale grass horizon, and then nothing at all. She did not feel sad in the way she had half expected to. She felt the clean, specific sensation of space opening ahead. The journey north was 10 days through the Kansas grassland and into the Nebraska territory, and up through the rough country into Wyoming. They camped most nights, building small fires in the cold, and Frances discovered several things about herself on that journey that she had not previously known. That she was considerably less bothered by rough sleeping than she would have predicted, that she could make a tolerable camp meal with very few resources, and that there was something specifically wonderful about lying in a wagon bed on a clear night with Luke beside her, and the stars above them in the extravagant quantity that stars only achieve when you are very far from lamplight. They talked through those nights, the loose, rambling conversations that come from long days of quiet proximity. He told her about his father, who had died when Luke was 16, a quiet, hard-working man who had farmed thin soil in eastern Texas and never complained about it, which Luke seemed to have decided was a form of dignity. She told him about growing up in Missouri, in a town so small that everyone's business was everyone else's business, which had made her very good at keeping her own counsel and mildly suspicious of people who talked too much about themselves. "You're not like that," he said, referring to the talking too much. "No," she said, "I talk an appropriate amount." He laughed into the dark. "You talk a specific amount," he said. "Every word counted. Is that a complaint?" "It is absolutely not a complaint," he said. "It's the most reassuring thing about a person. You know where you stand." She had smiled at the sky and thought about how she had said almost the same thing about Gerald once. She thought about the way some truths get said multiple times in a life, not because you forgot you knew them, but because the person worth saying them to keeps being different. They arrived in Laramie on a gray afternoon in early December. The town smaller and rougher than Caldwell, but with a quality of seriousness to it that she liked, a place that was doing the actual work of becoming itself, rather than performing what it thought a town should be. The land agent met them and took them out to the parcel the following morning. Frances stood at the edge of the property and looked at the 160 acres of winter-pale grass and the creek running dark between its banks and the mountains visible to the west, and she stood there for a long time with the cold wind in her face. "What do you think?" Luke asked from beside her. "I think the creek is better than you described," she said. He smiled. "Is that yes?" "That was always yes," she said. "I said yes in November in a store on Commerce Street in Caldwell, Kansas. The creek is just a bonus." He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and they stood there on the edge of what was going to be theirs, looking at it together in the clear, cold light. The first winter in Laramie was hard in the honest, practical way that first winters in new country always are. And Frances and Luke spent it, as people who are building something spend hard seasons with their heads down, and their hands busy, and the awareness of what they are building serving as both comfort and fuel. The existing structure on the property, a two-room cabin with a sound roof and a leaking floor at one corner, became livable within the first 2 weeks with the application of consistent work and some materials from the general store in town. Frances caulked and patched and cleaned, while Luke repaired the fence lines and shored up the small barn, and started the patient relationship building with the local ranchers that would eventually become the informal network every cattleman needed. She found that she liked the physical work of it in a way she hadn't anticipated. Running the dry goods store in Caldwell had been intellectual work, the management of numbers and relationships and decisions, and she was good at it, and it had sustained her. But this was different, the specific satisfaction of things that were wrong being made right with your own hands, of a leaking corner becoming a sound corner, of a cold, drafty room becoming a warm one through the particular alchemy of lumber and intention. They took their first cattle in the spring, 10 head, modest, enough to learn on. Luke knew cattle the way he knew horses, with the bodily intuition of a man who had spent years in close proximity to them, and Frances learned from him with the same seriousness she had brought to learning the store, which was to say completely. In May of 1880, she told him she was expecting a child. She told him at breakfast simply, because she was not a woman who made elaborate occasion of things when a plain statement would do. She told him and then watched his face move through several things in quick succession: surprise, which was honest, and then something that settled into a joy so full and specific, it seemed almost to need more room than his face had available for it. He stood up from the table and came around to her side and put his hands on her shoulders and looked at her with those dark, careful eyes that she had catalogued since the first morning he walked into her store. "Frances," he said. "I know," she said. He pulled her to him and she let him hold her, and she was not a woman who cried easily, but the particular weight of this moment, the accumulated weight of grief, turned to something else, of the store and the plane and the November church and the wagon journey and the hard winter and the spring morning and the child who was not yet anything but already everything pressed through her, and she let it quietly into the shoulder of his shirt. "A boy or a girl," he said, into her hair. "I don't mind which." "I know you don't," she said. "Though if it's a boy," he said, "I'd like to name him something with some weight to it." "We'll discuss that when the time comes," she said, pulling back and wiping her eyes with the back of her hand with the brisk practicality that was her natural mode of recovering from feeling too much. "Right now you need to fix the fence on the north side before those cows get into the Calloway place again." He grinned at her, wide and unguarded in a way he only ever was when they were alone. "Yes, ma'am," he said. In September of 1880, their son was born. They named him Thomas Gerald Barnett, Thomas for Luke's father, and Gerald for Frances's husband, a name that Luke had suggested himself one evening without any particular ceremony, and which had struck Frances with a force of gratitude she had not been able to immediately speak around. Thomas was born in the cabin with a local midwife named Clara Huston, who had delivered half the children in the Laramie Valley, and had the matter-of-fact expertise and specific kindness that the work required. He was born loud and healthy and with a great deal of dark hair, which made Luke laugh in the doorway of the bedroom. "He looks like he's already got opinions," Luke said. "Then he's mine," Frances said, exhausted and clear-eyed and holding the baby against her chest. "He's ours," Luke said, which was the right answer. Thomas grew the way children grow in open country, with the unself-conscious confidence of someone who has never been short of space. By his second year, he was following his father around the ranch with a seriousness that made the ranch hands, of whom there were now two, a young man named Abel, and an older man named Pete who had been working the Wyoming grasslands since before statehood, visibly amused. He had Frances's eyes, which were gray and direct, and Luke's way of being quiet when he was paying close attention. The ranch grew with the deliberate patience that Luke had always planned for it. Not fast, not dramatically, but steadily and soundly, each year a little more established than the last, the herd building, the buildings improving, the land earning its potential. Frances managed the financial side of it with the same meticulous attention she had brought to the store ledgers, and she and Luke made decisions together around the kitchen table in the evenings, with the specific compatibility of two people who have different strengths, and the good sense to respect that difference. The inquiry and subsequent legal proceedings in the Prout matter resolved in the spring of 1881, when Delman Cole was found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder and sentenced to 15 years at the federal penitentiary. Cole's cattle operation was sold off in parcels to pay restitution, and the man named Rigby, who had been the actual shooter, received a separate verdict and a longer sentence. Frances received the news in a letter from Deputy Crane, who had since been promoted to sheriff of Caldwell following Moss Denton's retirement. She read it at the kitchen table with Thomas on her lap trying to get at the letter. She passed it across to Luke. He read it, set it down, looked at it for a moment. "Hector Prout," he said. "Hector Prout," she said. It was enough of a thing to say. The acknowledgement of it, the knowledge that the scales had moved toward something like balance even if they could never be perfectly level, was a real and solid thing. She thought about the gray morning of June, 1879, about the gallows and the crowd and the specific terror of speaking into a silence she had no guarantee would receive her. She thought about the man she had not known who had stood at the foot of those steps with his head up, and the current she had felt when she looked at him, which she had not understood at the time but which had turned out to be her life rearranging itself around something permanent. "Luke," she said. He looked up from the letter. "Thank you," she said, "for asking my name." He looked at her with the expression she had never stopped being glad to see. "You were the first thing worth asking about," he said. She picked up Thomas and stood and walked around the table to him and sat beside him, and he put his arm around her and she leaned into his shoulder, and Thomas grabbed at her hair with small, imperious hands. Outside the window the Wyoming morning was wide and gold, the mountains clear in the western distance, the creek catching light in long, shifting flashes through the grass. The ranch spread out in every direction, theirs, built year by year from intention and work, and the steady accumulation of something that was becoming more itself every season it existed, which was exactly what he had said he wanted to build that afternoon on the Kansas plain when she had been paying close attention. She was always paying close attention. In the spring of 1882, she told him she was expecting a second child. He was out in the north field when she found him, mending fence with Abel, and she walked out to him across the bright spring grass with her skirt in the wind and told him when she reached him. He looked at her the same way he had looked at her the first time, surprised, and then full. That fullness that was bigger than his face had room for. Abel, demonstrating the excellent judgment of a man who has worked for the same family long enough to understand the moment, found a fence post that needed urgent attention 50 yards away. "Another one," Luke said. "Another one," she confirmed. He took her face in his work-roughed hands and kissed her there in the north field with the spring wind, carrying the smell of new grass and the mountains clear to the west. And Frances, who was not a woman who lost herself in moments, but rather one who collected them with care, felt this one come in through every available sense and find its place alongside the others she was keeping. Their daughter was born in October of 1882. They named her Clara Elise Barnett, after the midwife who had delivered Thomas and after Luke's mother, whose middle name was Elise and who cried when she received the letter, and who came up from Amarillo the following spring to stay through the summer, and held her granddaughter with the specific, uncomplicated wonder of a woman who had raised her son to find something worth building, and was now getting to see what he'd built. Luke's mother, whose name was Ruth, approved of Frances with a thoroughness and directness that Frances found refreshing. She approved of her the way a careful woman approves of another careful woman, by watching how she managed the difficult things, the unexpected things, the days when Thomas was sick and the fence was down and the price of beef had dropped, and observing that Frances met all of those things with the same clear-eyed steadiness she brought to everything. "He told me about the Gallows," Ruth said one evening, while they were sitting on the porch after supper, watching the long Wyoming dusk. Frances looked at her. "Not right away," Ruth said. "He told me in a letter after you'd been married some months. He told me the whole of it." She looked at Frances with dark eyes that were very like her son's. He said he was standing there thinking it was finished, and then a woman he'd never seen spoke up in front of 60 people and the whole thing turned. Frances looked at the mountains going purple and rose in the dusk. "Someone had to," she said. "That's what he said you'd say," Ruth said. "He told me you'd say it just like that." She paused. "What he also told me, and you won't have expected this part, is that standing there at those steps, seeing you for the first time, before he even knew who you were or why you were speaking, he said he thought, 'This is the kind of woman a man builds a life for.'" Frances sat very still with that for a moment. "That's a great deal to think about a stranger," she said. "Well," Ruth said, with the mild satisfaction of a woman who has been right about something important, "it seems like he was right." The summer that Ruth visited was a good summer, full and warm and busy in the way of a ranch that is finding its stride. Thomas, nearly 2, followed his grandmother everywhere with the intense focus of a small person encountering someone new and interesting. And Clara slept and ate and watched the world from wherever. Frances set her down with the specific, alert attention of a baby who is already forming opinions. Abel married a young woman from the settlement in late summer, and the wedding took place in the Barnett Ranch yard, which had grown into a proper homestead by then, with a larger main house that Luke and a neighbor named Jasper Crane, no relation to the Caldwell deputy, just a coincidence of names that Frances always found slightly amusing, had spent the better part of the previous autumn building. There was a table set up in the yard and food that Frances and the neighboring women had made, and someone brought a fiddle, and the evening went long and warm and easy in the way of celebrations that earned their looseness through shared work. Luke danced with her twice. He was not a practiced dancer, which she had known after the first time they had danced together at a settlement gathering the previous year, but he was enthusiastic and he held her with a care that made the clumsiness beside the point. "You're going to put me through a fence," she told him, after the second dance deposited them somewhat chaotically near the water trough. "I'm getting better," he said. "You are not getting better," she said, "but I appreciate the commitment." He laughed and she laughed with him, and Ruth, watching from a chair near the fire, smiled the smile of a woman watching something she helped bring into the world reach its full expression. That night, after the guests had gone and the children were asleep, Frances and Luke sat on the porch steps in the dark. The fire in the yard had burned down to coals and the stars were out in their full Wyoming abundance, and the creek was audible in the quiet, a steady low murmur that she had come to think of as the sound of the land breathing. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She considered it honestly, as was her practice. "I am thinking about Caldwell," she said. "About the way I thought my life was a finished thing, a sealed thing, the store and the ledgers and the space where Gerald had been. I thought that was the shape of it and I had made my peace." He was listening in the full, specific way he always listened. "And then I got an unsigned letter in the dark and I couldn't sleep and I went to a hanging and I spoke," she said. "And you asked my name. Before my feet touched the ground," he said. She looked at him. She had not told him she had thought of it that way. "Before your feet touched the ground," she confirmed. He looked back at her with those eyes in the starlight. "I needed to know it," he said. "I was standing there thinking that if someone was going to change everything, I wanted to know their name." She took his hand where it rested on the step between them. His fingers closed around hers with the ease of something thoroughly practiced, something done so many times it has become its own kind of home. "Francis Slater," she said. "Francis Barnett," he said, with a warmth in his voice that was its own kind of claim and its own kind of gift. She leaned against him and they sat there on the porch steps in the Wyoming night with the stars above them and the sleeping children behind them, and the 160 acres of good grass and reliable water and deep grass ahead of them. And the future was not a sealed thing or a finished thing but a living thing, going on the way flat land goes on, without apology and without the need of it. The years that followed were the kind of years that are sometimes mistaken for ordinary because they are built of days rather than events, but which accumulate into something extraordinary if you have the patience to look at the whole of them. They had those years. They used them well. Thomas grew tall and serious, and had a gift for horses that seemed to come from both directions of his heritage: Luke's bodily understanding of animals and Francis's capacity for patient, attentive observation. By the time he was 8, he was helping with the herd in the way of a child who has grown up with work and doesn't distinguish it from the rest of living. Clara grew into a girl of startling opinions and a laugh that carried across the ranch yard and could make a man in the middle of hard work put down his tools and smile. Abel and his wife had 2 children of their own, and the ranch became the kind of place that a small community grows around, not by design, but by the natural gravity of a place that is well-run and generous with its yard. Jasper Crane and his family became the Barnetts' closest neighbors and friends, the kind of friends who show up when there is hard work and stay when the work is done. In 1884, the statehood movement for Wyoming Territory began gathering the serious momentum that would eventually bring Wyoming into the Union. And with it, the women's suffrage provision that Wyoming had held since 1869, the first in any territory or state in the nation. Francis, who had always followed the movements of law and governance with the interest of a woman who understood that such things determined the daily conditions of life, followed the progress of statehood with particular attention. She and Luke talked about it at length over the kitchen table in the evenings. She talked about it with Ruth, who had returned from Amarillo and taken up what seemed to be a permanent auxiliary residence in the Laramie Valley, having concluded that her grandchildren were a better reason to relocate than any she had left in Texas. "They let women vote here," Thomas announced one evening at supper, with the tone of a child reporting a fact he has recently discovered and is still processing. "They do," Francis said. "Why don't they everywhere?" he asked. There was a brief pause around the table. Luke looked at Francis in the way that meant he was very interested in how she was going to handle this. "Because not everywhere has caught up yet," she said. "But it doesn't mean they're not going to." Thomas considered this with the deliberate seriousness that was his most characteristic expression. "That doesn't seem very fair," he said. "It isn't," Francis said. "But they will," he said. "They will," she said. He went back to his supper satisfied, and Clara stole a biscuit from his plate in the distraction, which he noticed immediately, and the moment dissolved into the ordinary beautiful friction of a family at a table. By 1885, the Barnett Ranch had grown to be a respected and productive operation in the Laramie Valley. Luke had the quiet, accumulating reputation of a man who dealt fairly and worked honestly, and whose word was a reliable thing. Frances was known in the settlement, and beyond it as a businesswoman. She had begun helping other settlers with their bookkeeping, a practice that had started with a neighbor's desperate request and grown into something more structured, a service that she provided for a modest and appropriate fee, and which filled some particular part of her that the store had also filled. She was not a woman who needed to be busy. She was a woman who needed to be useful, which was a different and more durable thing. In the late fall of 1885, a letter arrived from Caldwell that she had been half expecting for 4 years. It was from James Ashworth, Mabel's nephew, who now ran what had been her store. He wrote to tell her that the store had prospered, he had expanded it, added a hardware section, taken on a second counter, and that he thought of her every time someone came in for dried beans, which she found pleasing. He also wrote to tell her that Mabel Ashworth had died in her sleep the previous spring, peacefully and at a good age, and that the Reverend had said in the eulogy that Mabel had spent her life making room for people who needed it, which Frances read 3 times with her throat tight. She wrote back. She told James she was glad the store was thriving. She told him that Gerald had built a good thing, and she was glad it had found good hands after hers. She told him that Caldwell was where her life had changed in ways she could not be grateful enough for. She sealed the letter and set it with the morning's outgoing mail and went to find Luke, who was in the barn with Thomas doing the early evening feeding. She stood in the barn doorway watching them, her husband and her son moving through the familiar tasks with the easy synchrony of people who have done things together long enough to read each other's next move, and she felt the specific, full-bodied contentment of a life that had become exactly what she had been working toward without always knowing it. Luke looked up and saw her in the doorway. His face did what it had always done when it found her moved into that particular gladness, quiet and deep and unchanged by time. "Everything all right?" he asked. "Everything is fine," she said. "Mabel Ashworth is gone. I wanted to tell you." He put down the feed bucket and came to her and put his hand against her cheek. "I'm sorry," he said. "She was a good woman," Frances said. "She gave you a room when you needed one, and she stood up at our wedding." She paused. "I hope someone says that kind of thing about me when my time comes, not the room part specifically." "They'll say a great deal more than that," he said. "You're biased," she said. "Irredeemably," he agreed. The children's voices came from somewhere across the yard. Clara had apparently discovered something in the creek that required Thomas's immediate assessment, and their arguing about it had the comfortable, practiced quality of siblings who genuinely like each other beneath the surface friction. The last light was going off the mountains in the west, that specific November gold, and the air was cold and clean. Frances stood in the barn doorway with her husband's hand warm against her face, and the sound of her children's voices in the yard and the darkness coming in gently from the east, and she thought about a June morning in Caldwell, and a gallows and 60 people watching, and a woman who couldn't sleep, and an unsigned letter, and a man who asked her name. She thought about the way a life pivots. Not always on the dramatic things, not on the things you see coming and brace for, but sometimes on a sleepless night, and a letter pushed under a door, and the decision, arrived at somewhere between dark and dawn, to open your mouth and say what needs to be said. She had stood at that gallows for a man she did not know. He had asked her name before his feet touched the ground, and here they were. "Luke," she said. "Frances," he said. No other words needed. After all this time, the names were enough. They carried everything, the whole story, all of it, from the gallows to the plain to the November church to the Wyoming creek and the children's voices in the yard and the mountains and the years that were not finished and not sealed but alive and ongoing, every one of them better than the last. "Come inside," she said. "Supper's on." He dropped his hand from her face and took her hand instead, and they walked together across the yard in the last of the November light, toward the house with the lamp burning warm in the window, toward the voices of their children, toward the kitchen table, and the evening and whatever came after, which was going to be good, which was going to be theirs. Thomas held the barn door for his father with the dignity of a boy who has decided he is old enough for such gestures. And Clara came running in from the creek with mud on her boots and a story that would not wait. And Luke Barnett, who had once walked to the foot of a gallows with his head up and nothing left but what he was, put his arm around his wife's shoulders and came home.